Batman, and that's just a filthy, dirty lie. I don't have a paper, neither on Kierkegaard nor on Batman. I am going to talk about that. I have some notes I made. What I had a paper on was Lars von Trier. I have one aha, and the rest of you are exactly the reason I'm not talking about Lars von Trier, because you don't know who he is. Right? I think he's my favorite film director. He's also Danish like Kierkegaard, so we're still going to get the brooding and anxiety that we get with the wonderful Danish people. But not through Lars von Trier, but through Soren Kierkegaard, and instead I'm going to talk about Batman and Kierkegaard. But Dan, I am replacing Robert R., and he was going to present to you something wonderful, I'm sure, about philosophy for stupid people, or why stupid people need philosophy, something of this nature. And Dr. Lane asked me, could I still, talk a bit generally about pop culture and maybe something of what Dr. Arp is going to do and philosophy for stupid people. And so I was thinking a little bit, what does this phrase pop culture even mean? And the word pop is for popular, and popular has to do with the populace, or the people. And so what is culture for the people, or the many, or the masses? And culture, I think, has to do with cultivation. I think those are at least related terms. And so it seemed to me that there were maybe two options of what pop culture might actually mean. Either it seemed to me that it's an oxymoron, namely, nothing popular can actually be cultural. Everything popular is apparently just a bunch of phooey, and everything that is cultural has to be high art and not for the populace, or not for the masses. Or the other option, it seemed to me, was that pop culture was almost a truism of sorts, such that nothing could be cultural unless it sees the masses, or the populace. And so there are these two options, but I think I'm going to assume the latter option, namely that something can only be cultural if it's popular, which means that something does not have to be high art or fine art to actually be cultural. Something can be very lowbrow. Perhaps many would argue that this film is lowbrow. I've heard people argue both ways, in fact, that something can be lowbrow, doesn't have to be fine or high art, and it can still be cultural because it still cultivates the masses, oftentimes without them even knowing that is the case or what's happening. This is how propaganda would work, right? Something cultivates the masses, and the masses do not even know that it's happening before their very eyes. And so this is what I think is happening here. And so I'm assuming that the populace is influenced by, that is cultivated by, more than they actually understand. Many times you've probably had the experience where you watch a movie with someone and you think it's a wonderful movie with all of these profound and deep themes, and then you talk to the person next to you, maybe you're out on a date with a stupid boy or a stupid girl, and you say, what did you think of the movie? And it becomes obvious that they understood none of it, had a very facile and superficial understanding of the movie, right? But yet they're still affected by the movie. They still say all of the buzzwords. It's like Seinfeld. Everyone yada yada yadas now and knows what that means. And so they're still cultivated by it, and they're still affected by it. It still has an efficacious influence in society and culture, yet even without being understood, and certainly understood in a properly philosophical sense. And so I think something can be influential and become part of the culture before it is understood. And that the task of the philosopher, these things therefore beg to be understood. They are not cultural because they are understood, but because they are cultural, do they demand that we try to understand them? I would rather say it in that order. Good. So, I will say then that culture and understanding, culture is therefore born out of what is not culture, or the uncultivated. And that understanding is therefore born out of what is not yet understood, or is born out of ignorance, or we can say that culture and understanding are in fact born out of stupidity. I might even be as extreme, if you will permit me some poetic license, to say that culture and understanding are nothing but coordinated stupidity. When we try to But that means that then stupidity and ignorance are not merely an absence of something. It's a very positive something that is just not yet organized or coordinated. So perhaps what I'll try to do today, if you'll permit me this, is to take something that may or may not be lowbrow, may or may not be stupid and just a fun action film, but see if I can coordinate its stupidity a little bit and make it sound a little less stupid and a bit more cultivated for you. Fair enough?
Fair
he wanted to say philosophy for stupid people. I think that, in fact, philosophers are quite in debt to stupidity, rather than vice versa. If it was not for stupidity that philosophers need to coordinate, we would have nothing to talk about. So rather, we should be very thankful that there's this stupidity out there, instead of standing above them saying, let me help you out. We would have nothing to do if it were not for this uncultivated substrate upon which we can build culture, upon this ignorance upon which we can build understanding and knowledge. So I'm going to talk about Soren Kierkegaard first, and then I'm going to show you a clip or two or three of Batman and try to show how Batman may be better understood through some things that Soren Kierkegaard has to tell us. But that actually means you're going to need to hold in mind what Soren Kierkegaard has to say. You're going to have to hold in your mind a little bit about what you know of Batman. I assume all of you have probably seen the film. By the way, I'm mostly talking about this Batman film and the ones from Christopher Nolan. I'm not going to talk about the ones from DC Comics, Tim Burton and the like, right? But you will also need to understand a little something, I think, about Kierkegaard's interpretation of the Abraham and Isaac story. And so in the Abraham and Isaac story, it's a biblical story from Genesis where God says to Abraham, and in this case it's actually the Elohim God, or not the Yahweh God, says to Abraham, go take your son Isaac, bind him to an altar, and plunge a knife right into your own son, right? And many of you probably hear this as a bedtime story because you just grew up with this, but I want you to let it sink in for a minute how scandalous this story actually is. Take your own son up to a mountain and slaughter him, even though he's done nothing wrong. And this action, which we would normally call something like to kill someone, and to kill someone unjustly, we would normally call what? Murder, of course. But yes, in Abraham's case, it's not called murder. It's called righteousness, it's called fidelity. He's the father of faith, therefore, and the father of nations, which I would think would only add to the scandal of how scandalous this story is. So keep that story in mind, and let's analyze this story according to these three criteria I have on the board, and I think those will be helpful again when we come back to Batman. So, Kierkegaard has, quote-unquote, 3 stages on life's way. Shockingly enough, you can read more about this in a text entitled Stages on Life's Way. And so the first, it will be the least important for us, but let me put it up here, is the aesthetic stage. And I'm going to look at these for how we make decisions. It's a matter of decisiveness for Kierkegaard, how decisions come about. And the aesthetic way of making decisions, I think, is something like when something merely gives itself to me or merely impinges itself upon me as good or beautiful, pleasing or not pleasing, something I like or don't like. Like, ooh, a shiny thing over there. Ooh, a piece of candy. Ooh, a piece of candy. I think that's James Woods, yes. Right. And so it gives itself to me immediately as pleasing or displeasing, as good or bad, as beautiful or ugly, and the like. So we have immediacy. Yes, my handwriting is horrible. And it's a subjective immediacy, in the sense that everyone would use that word in the most unthoughtful way. And we say, oh, that's just subjective, or that's just relative. It strikes me as a particular or an individual subject immediately a certain way. Particular or individual. Now, when we get to the ethical stage on life's way, he's always going to associate this with Immanuel Kant, I think, first and foremost. In Kant's ethics, I don't know what I can assume you know about it, but in Kantian ethics, one should only do certain actions that could be universalizable, such an action that you could universalize and say everyone ought to do this action, right? So while I might say, oh, well, I don't like driving 70 on the interstate, and I don't really, I would rather drive 80 or 90 on the interstate, that is for me to affirm my particular desires or maxims over what I could universalize for others to do. So for Kantian ethics, it always has to do with universality as opposed to what is particular or individual. And the reason it is universal is because everything is not up to your particular whim or caprice, but it is the mediation of the law, the universal law. So here we have mediation, and here we have immediacy. And the law is therefore valid for everyone, and that which is valid for everyone, we typically say, is objective. So the objective law that is universal rather than particular laws that I give myself when it might be convenient, something of that sort. But what becomes peculiar then is when we get to the third stage on life's way, which in Kierkegaard's term is the religious stage on life's way, although I find that that term might be a bit misleading, because lots of times people, when they hear that term, the religious, they can only think on institutional and organized religions and sitting in a pew and engaging in certain rites and rituals and practices that you would do at the church or at the synagogue, where in Kierkegaard's sense, I don't think it has anything to do with that so much as it has to do with faithfulness or fidelity. And so instead of calling it the religious stage, I might refer to it rather as the stage of faithfulness or the stage of fidelity. Good. But what we have here is we have everything that we see up here, again, in fact. It is not you are not conforming to an objective law, but it is an immediate response to when a beloved one, for example, like your boyfriend or your girlfriend or your wife or husband asks you to do something, you do not first say to them, well, give me the objective criteria why I ought to do that. And if I find that that can be universalized into valid reasons that can be mediated to everyone, then I'll do it. Rather, she asks me to do something crazy, and I say, okay, and I go do it. Right? Immediate response, not objective rules, but it is subjective in this sense again, or we'll see it as a subject-to-subject relation. And instead of being universal, all faithfulness is particular and individual. And so we have many of the same terms here that we have here, and yet it functions in a quite different manner, of course. The subjectiveness that is here, or the inwardness that is here, is quite different from what we see here. The immediacy here is quite different from the immediacy that we see there. And so what that difference is about, hopefully you all can intuitively understand, because I have very limited time here to tell you more in depth what I mean. Oh, good. So, I'll pause as if I were in class here. It is a classroom. Does anyone have questions on what something like this might mean? Are we completely confused? Have I butchered it? Or is this framework more or less okay?
I have a comment. Aren't the three stages about being faithful, the only thing that really changes is toward what you are being faithful? Because the aesthetic is being faithful to himself. In the second level, I would say that the person is faithful to society, to the community. And in the third stage, he's just faithful to God.
Well, faithful to God, or I think we can extrapolate it to larger issues. It might be to God, but I think it could just be to any other or to any person. What you'll see here is it's a personal relation. And what you'll see here as the ethical, and oftentimes even up here, is that it can be quite impersonal. So for Kant, for example, when you relate to the universal, you are relating to the law. It's very impersonal. Or even if I only treat you a certain way, if I treat you with dignity and respect because you're a human being, that's in fact very impersonal. But what's your name, by the way?
Dora.
If I treat you with dignity and respect because you're Dora, because you're a particular and you're a subject, that's a personal relation. I can relate to you immediately or directly. But if I only relate to you through our common humanity, if our relation is mediated through that middle term, or that third term, or that common term, then our relationship is not immediate, but mediated. It is not direct, but indirect, because we relate through that third thing out there that we both share in common, humanity. So like, I used to live in New Orleans, and I would get so frustrated because you can never make a left turn anywhere because of all the medians in the road. You have to go through and then make a U-turn and come back and make a right. And so the median is that middle term or that common term or that third term that creates a buffer between the two roads. You're on the interstate. This road that goes this way and this one that goes this way never actually interact, at least not immediately, but always only mediately, or through the median, the third term, the common term. It always creates a distance or a buffer. So it's not as risky, it's not as dangerous. There's a distance between you and I. I don't relate to you directly. I relate to humanity as some third term, and you relate to humanity as some third term. And then we say that we relate to each other in that way. when in fact we don't directly immediately. Yeah.
Is the third one to an authority then? Is that the...
No, not for Kierkegaard at least. If by authority you mean something impersonal again, like the authority of the state or the authority of the law, but it's relating always to something personal. You tell me to do something and I don't say, well, show me how that could correspond to a law or show me how that's reasonable. To give reasons for something is always to give an account of something that would also be understandable for a third party, for an eavesdropper, right? But if you cannot give reasons for your action, but someone does what you say anyway, then they do it out of this immediate fidelity, and not through the, make it objective for me, give me reasons that would also be valid for a third party should they be here. That's what we see happening at the ethical sphere, and what Kierkegaard will say is that someone who has achieved the ethical stage, and that's wonderful, very few of you will do it, most of you are dirty heathens up here, achieve the ethical would be great, wonderful, and that might make you what we call a hero. Kierkegaard's terms. He says, but this is better still, this third stage, in which you do not have ethical or moral virtue, but you have personal virtue, and that would make you, in Kierkegaard's terms, a knight of faith. So obviously Kierkegaard's reading it, he wants to say that Abraham is a knight of faith and not a hero, right? Abraham offers no justification or reasons that could be mediated to a third party why he's taking Isaac up. God offers Abraham no reasons or justification that could be universalized or mediated to a third party. According to this viewpoint, Abraham is a murderer, according to the universal law. But according to this viewpoint, he's called the father of faith or a knight of faith, because he expresses fidelity or faithfulness to God without having these mediating reasons that would draw in the third party or the crowd to make the relationship less individual. Does that help? And so that can probably bring us up to here, I think, where we can look at a short clip from Batman. Or I'll talk a little bit more first. But in Batman, the question that we'll see is, and we'll look at the clip that some of you probably already remember. You can leave it on for a second. I'm sorry. I moved forward too fast. But in Batman, you all probably remember, we'll see it shortly, when he says, oh, Batman's not a hero. Right? But rather we have to chase him, blah, blah, blah. He is, and here they call him a dark knight. Well, he says he's not a hero, he's a knight, a dark knight. I think that's very close to the term that we in fact see in Kierkegaard. He's not a hero. It's arguably, I'm going to try to make it plausible for you at least, Batman does not operate at this stage, at the ethical stage, but rather operates at this stage. He expresses fidelity somehow at oftentimes at the expense of the ethical. So just as what Abraham's action did was, in Kierkegaard's terms, suspended the ethical, suspension of the ethical. Normally his action is called murder, but in this case not. Normally Batman would be called a vigilantist, someone who operates outside the universal law. But we want to say, but rather maybe he's at this third sphere, is what I'm going to be driving at eventually. Good. So let me unpack it just a bit further until we look at this stuff. So, the ethical, I'll have 5 little points here. The ethical task of each individual, says Kierkegaard, is to conform to the universal. But as Kant would say, that rule that should be a maxim for all people. And normally, if someone does not conform to the universal, but instead affirms their particular whims and fancies, that is normally called what? Oh, well, it's the aesthetic, but he says normally if you do not conform to the universal law and rather elect your own laws that do not conform, that abolish the universal and affirm the particular, he says normally that is called sin. That's called wrongdoing, he says. Living by your own rule and not following the universalizable laws, he says normally that would be called sin, or wrongdoing, or being unethical or immoral. He says, but in the case of Abraham, and maybe in the case of Batman, we'll see how plausible I can make it for you, we have this strange paradox where someone affirms their subjective particularity and individuality at the expense of the universal law, and it is not to be called sin, but rather to be called faith or fidelity, or something of that sort. And he says that's very peculiar. I hope it strikes you as peculiar. someone operating outside the law, murdering their own son, someone operating outside the law as a vigilante, not taking off the mask for the law, and yet we call him the knight of faith, or a dark knight, rather than a dirty, filthy sinner.
It wouldn't be a knight by having a personal relationship with themselves, and then showing fidelity to themselves.
It's a good question. I'm inclined to say for Kierkegaard, at least, no. For an issue I'll come to later, number 5 there, the I-thou. Personal relation seems to always imply personal relation to the you, or to thou, or to the other. But whether or not yourself could be treated as a thou or a you, that's possible.
Yeah, I just add, Kierkegaard would say at the aesthetic level there is no self to have a relationship to. It has to develop.
Yeah, and that's another point we'll come to in this issue of decisiveness. There's only really a self or an entity there at all once you are decisive. And someone at the aesthetic stage will never, the aesthetic stage you never make a decision, right? Because we'll see the decision is going to have to do with this either or. You choose A or you choose not A. You go to the store and you say, well, at the store you make only aesthetic decisions. She told me not to talk about her. Go to the store. We need some fruit, Tyler. Okay, we'll get some fruit. Well, do I want bananas or apples? Bananas or apples? Bananas. And we walk down. You know, I'm going back. I'm getting apples. Look at that. No, you know, I don't want any fruit. And I come back. No decision is made because whatever she didn't choose, or whomever didn't choose, is always held over here in limbo. As if it doesn't matter that I didn't choose this, I didn't really not choose it, because if I decide later, I change my mind, I'll just come back and get it. Or I'll take all the fruit, or I'll take none of the fruit. But the decisions are not forced there. I can take all fruit, I can take none of the fruit, I can take one of the fruit, I can change my mind, I can come back, I can do this, that, and the other. But a true decision is just that, it's a decision, it's a cut. Where you cut away that which you did not choose as no longer possible, as no longer a live option, which means you're decisive, so you're not torn apart at the seams. I'll choose this, ooh, a piece of candy, ooh, a shiny thing. But you actually have a real decisive center, because you have chosen one thing. Purity of heart is to will one thing, another lovely Kierkegaardian text in this respect. You've just chosen one thing, decided on one thing, and all other options that you didn't choose don't even appear as options anymore. You've cut them off as feasible options, since your choice appears like destiny or fate. This is why I think when we speak to beloved, we say, why do you love me? And we say, well, as if I can give reasons. The honest answer is there was no other choice. I have not loved you. And it does appear as if there's no other choice, because when I made that choice, I cut off the other options as no longer actually options. So I say, what choice did I have? You were the only one for me. And then she goes, we're all I think that's why it appears that way. I'm not lying when I say you were the only option. That's true. Those other options were cut off as no longer valid. Yeah.
For Kierkegaard, wouldn't you need a kind of a direct connection to the absolute, or what you discern as God, in order to properly attach to the logical extension of the ethical?
Right. And so this is the issue. The problem is with the ethical, if you are ethical, if you conform to the universal, if you don't conform to it, we normally say that's unethical or sin. He says, but now we have the strange paradox of faith, where someone affirms their particularity at the expense of the universal, and it's not called sin, but fidelity. And he says this is because you are in an absolute relation to the absolute. The to the absolute part will bracket off to this part. But absolute relation, well, what does the word absolute mean? Absolute literally means to be without relation. A relation without relation. That's what absolute relation means. So what we find here where there's mediation is that I forgot your name, tell me again. I forget your name. Dora. I related to Dora through that common or third or middle term, or common humanity. But here, there is no middle term through which I would relate that would mediate our relation one to the other. So it is, as it were, a relation without mediation, or without mediated relation. It is absolute relation without relation. And that, I want to say, is the immediacy of your stage of fidelity, is that absolute relation, or relation without relation.
In the Batman analogy, I guess, would you say that he has a relation without relation?
I'm going to save that.
Okay.
I'll get to that in a minute. I first want to erect Kierkegaard here, and then we'll look at the Batman. And yeah.
It seems to me that if we follow the logic of Kierkegaard, we are the only ones who can decide whether we are on the third stage or not, right? People
Yes,
around us,
only-
nobody can decide
That's
that
right.
we are on either phase.
Because if you judge someone from a third-party perspective,
Right.
from a middle, impartial, objective perspective, if I judge Abraham from a third-party perspective, he's a murderer.
Right.
If I judge Batman from a third-party perspective, he cannot but appear as a vigilante outside the law. But if I try, as it were, as the saying we go, to put myself in his shoes, to ask, but subjectively, what is the disposition that is occurring here? Well, then maybe I will have a different judgment. But from the third-party perspective, you're right. I can say nothing about their subjective state of fidelity, whether they're doing it for ulterior motives or out of fidelity, because I'm operating from this third-party objective perspective, which means I can say nothing about it.
So it doesn't make sense that we can make a judgment about Batman.
I cannot make an objective one at any rate. I mean, this is what I can always be wrong. Abraham was either a psychotic and a loon and a nut, or the father of all nations. Batman is either a psychotic and a loon and a nut, or the Dark Knight, the Knight of Faith. But he's one or the other, says Kierkegaard, because there's no middle term to take him here. He can't be both. He's one or the other, right? But can I say definitively which one he is? No, certainly not. Certainly not. And in that sense, I'm only presenting possibilities. What will make my students uncomfortable when I say this is I'll present these sorts of images, and some students won't like Kierkegaard yet, and some will like him very much, and I say, but let me tell you another story. I'm from Missouri originally, which is very close to Kansas, and in Kansas it's the Westboro Baptist Church, where the guy that pickets the funerals of people that have come back from war and died who thought it was an unjust war, pickets funerals of homosexuals, and I say, well, arguably what he does is objectively wrong and incorrect. It's quite possible, and I can't say definitively, but it's possible that he does it with a pure heart and out of absolute fidelity. It's possible that he would be part of the kingdom of heaven even though what he does is wrong, does not conform to a universal law.
This is always a question of perspective, because if I kill
Yes.
somebody, I'm never going to say I did it because I am a crazy person. I'm always going to say that I'm
You might say that because you're lying, but you also might say it genuinely. So even though you would be wrong when you say it with a pure heart.
So members of the Manson family cult might be religious like?
They might be.
Or terrorists, right?
Right, but they're one or the other. They are not somewhere between. They are either absolute loons or they're knights of faith. And you're right, I cannot say which they are definitively from an objective viewpoint. Can't be done. I only hold out the possibility that they could be. I'm not supposed to say this, and if you went out of this room and asked me, I didn't say it. Hitler could be, for example. Now, in Hitler's case, we have the problem that he tries to justify his actions ad nauseum by writing Mein Kampf and an autobiography of his life, whereas in the Abraham story, he remains completely silent. Right? He doesn't offer reasons for his actions, because if you offer reasons for your actions, you yourself seem to be placing yourself at this level where you want to offer reasons which could be valid to the third-party perspective and therefore universalized and objective. Your Abrahams, your Jesuses remain silent in certain respects. Your Batman remains silent, refuses to take off the mask, whereas your Hitler wants to justify his actions ad nauseum. That's probably a pretty difference too, I suppose. But not a definitive one, at any rate. It's still always possible at the end of the day that he was wrong, but with a pure heart. And it's possible, lots of times we know the opposite too. We know of people who are right ethically, but with not pure hearts and ulterior motives. I'm always telling Dan here, I'm like, I would much rather be friends with some idiot who's wrong, according to all ethical standards, believes in all sorts of heinous things, politically or otherwise, but have a pure heart, than someone who's always right, but actually doesn't care about people at all. It's just, I always have the most progressive opinion, and I don't have any patience for that person. But, I can never say for sure. If I judge someone, I judge them from a third-party perspective. I simply submit that it's always possible that it could be otherwise than that objective viewpoint. Fair enough? So the question for me, the most problematic question for me, will be whether Batman relates to a principle or a law, or whether he relates to something personal or a Tao. To me, that will be the most dubious question. But let's look at one of these clips then, and we'll finally jump into the fun stuff. I think Kierkegaard's fun, but that's why, I'm a philosopher and we're weird that way. So.